This week's National Park Service historic site visit is Fort Raleigh on the north end of Roanoke Island. This many-storied spot off the coast of North Carolina is an interesting look at how a place can have many names, many purposes, and invoke many feelings in different groups of people, and how it can be used as a symbol of so many different things over the span of a few hundred years. The United States of America, surly teenager of a country that it is, has few places of historical significance that have had time to grow layers, but this one has. Of course, it's on one of the barrier islands of North Carolina, so it might be facing some climatic dangers. On the other hand, it does have the Carolina Dunes of Nag's Head, where the Wrights Brother Memorial is tumbling into the sea, protecting it from the worst of the Atlantic Ocean wave action, so maybe it has a few extra years? Anyway, this island, besides being home to the Croatoan and other Carolina Algonquin, some of the very first tribes to make contact with Europeans, has been an outpost of an empire with expansionist dreams and an unrealistic money-making scheme. And let's face it, all the go abroad, make money schemes of the 15th century lacked planning. They just did. It's been a symbol of folly and failure. It's been a rallying cry for further exploration. It's been a mystery, a memorial, a symbol of tragedy, and one of fortitude. It was briefly set up as a freedmen's colony after the Civil War, but then became yet another symbol of broken promises to the formerly enslaved, as orders given on the battlefield were ignored or erased by the federal government. The site of Fort Raleigh, where the adventurers under Sir Walter Raleigh's wild scheme set up a beachhead, also became one of the first American locations to be excavated by American archaeologists as they worked to create the modern science of archaeology. Like many of the locations around the world dug up in the last part of the 19th century, the mix of fantasy and excavators starting with known goals created another layer of puzzles for later archaeologists to sort out. The excavations done in the 1890s and then later in the early 1900s went after the spot with some of the same destructive zeal and surety regarding what they were gonna find in much the same way Schliemann did as he hunted for the legendary gold of Troy. Today, the park containing Fort Raleigh and the early landing place of the Roanoke colony are open for viewing, as is a 1950s reconstruction of part of an earthwork according to what they were pretty sure it probably, what they really wanted it to be, along with a modern theater where a dramatization of colony life written in 1937 can also be seen. Fort Raleigh and Roanoke Island, off the coast of North Carolina, in the modern age, it's a bit remote. But it is also a beautiful place to step away from the modern, fast-paced urban life. But even as remote as this place can feel, this home to coastal piney woods, wetlands, shorebirds, and all manner of critters that roam the freshwater, saltwater, coastal, and interior environments, it's also one of those places that has layers of human history piled upon it. The chance to look at a spot in the U.S. that has figured in globe-spanning events for centuries, where those events were recorded and are accessible to us now, is rare. But Roanoke Island is one of those historical attractors. So go check it out, lift up the layers, and see how many different people mark this plot of land as important to their history and have their own forceful point of view. But goodness gracious, please do check the hurricane forecast before you go, and definitely bring your birding friend. For all that it's been in the crosshairs of history, Roanoke Island, North Carolina, because of that large variety of biomes and environments and access to the ocean, it's also a great island to watch the birds. Episode 134, Lessons from Early 19th Century American Stew. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at what is happening with American stew right now that stovetops and better, cheaper knives are possible, and there's more meat than the original colonists ever thought possible. But there are no tomatoes yet. Well, okay, not many tomatoes. Not many tomatoes in many places. But to hear about the accomplishments in the American stew world and how its regional styles can help us now, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that we are firmly in the age where American stew is going to start becoming a bad word. I'm not saying stewed things were necessarily great before. I've talked about food aboard ships after all. But the rapid expansion of America by people who barely knew how to build a proper hearth, much less cook over one, were about to encounter the problems of proper stew making. And while we think of stew season, fall and winterish, back in the 19th century and before, every season was stew season, whatever you were calling it. And accordingly, there were seasonal stews. To see if this period can offer you any guidance in the form of both do's and quite a few don'ts, for your next encounter with a crockpot, pressure cooker, or just your stovetop, let's take a look back. When most people were cooking over wood as a fuel source, whether in a stove or just over a fireplace set up for cooking, a non-professional cook who likely had a million things to do and several thousand other tasks to direct and supervise, a prototypical stewed recipe might go something like this one from Barbara Haber's book, From Hardtack to Home Fries. Now this one calls for 3 pounds of hard-worked beef crisscrossed by plenty of fibrous tissue, so a bottom round, a rump, or a chuck cut. Also, 3 pounds of bony chicken parts, not the parts with the meat on them, the other stuff. Oh yeah, and 1 or 2 beef soup bones. Think shins, knuckles, or the meaty bones left over from making roasts. Then you'd add 2 quarts of water and some salt. This would all be placed in a large soup pot and brought to a boil. A little more water might be added to cover the meat. And skimming would be expected as particulate gathered on the top of the water. Now, for the flavorings. 2 cups of chopped onion, 3 large carrots, also cut into chunks, 4 stalks of celery, and a leek, also cut. Add in 3 tablespoons of chopped parsley, a bay leaf, 8 peppercorns, and 3 whole allspice berries. In 3 tablespoons of oil, fry all of this up in a skillet until the onions, carrots, and celery are lightly browned. Then stir the rest of the flavorings in and add it all to the boiling beef, chicken parts, and soup bones. Turn down the heat to bring things to a simmer and leave it going for about 2 hours or until the 3 pounds of beef are tender. That is, it can be easily pieced with a fork, fork tender. And when the meat is tender enough, remove it from the pot. Skim the fat from the broth, strain out the solids, pressing them to release any flavorful juices. Slice the beef and serve it with horseradish and probably some brown bread. The resulting soup might be served before the beef or at a different meal with just the bread and a few new vegetables added into the broth. So the resulting soup could be served alongside. I specifically pulled this recipe as an example because Haber had adapted an Austrian dish that had become Americanized, and then she wrote it in a way so as to be accessible to 1980s American home cooks. And this whole operation sounds pretty accessible to cooks now. Okay, maybe except for the part where we need to find a pot big enough to hold a 3-pound chunk of beef, 3 more pounds of bony chicken parts, plus a few beef bones. But simple as it is, the recipe and method is still punched up a little bit from how it would have been made in the 19th century. The inclusion of celery and leeks is pretty modern. In the early 19th century, in America, celery was a fine and fancy vegetable. And leeks, well, those were some foreign onions. You might find them if someone had an English gardener or had English pretensions. So the bay leaves, they've been with us for always, since this leafy evergreen flourishes in a wide range of climates. But those peppercorns and allspice, well, that's the mark of a fancy kitchen with access to a dock on the Atlantic Ocean, or at least a merchant who has access to said dock. To be fair, these are small, light items, and they did find their way into many kitchen lockboxes by the end of the 1800s, so does not disqualify it from being a 19th century recipe. But the one step that would have been entirely unrecognizable to the 19th century cook is what happened to the vegetables before they went into the broth. They were browned separately. and not just in any old fat, but in an oil. While double cooking meats, say broiling then boiling, frying in a bit of butter coated with flour and then stewing, or boiling meat and then slicing it and simmering it in a sauce in a made dish, those were all common things to do. But cooking vegetables more than once in the same dish, now that was just odd. See, in fancy kitchens, either raw, trimmed, or sometimes cut vegetables were put in a broth to help flavor it and then strained out. Or they were added into stewed dishes near the end and cooked to doneness. Cooking, nay, browning vegetables and then adding them into a soup or a stew was just not a thing that was done. And even if it was, browning them in an oil? This would have left a 19th century cook rather at a loss. No matter how big or small your budget was in an American kitchen in the first half of the 19th century, there was no oil of any sort to cook with. It was butter or animal fat. It may have been cow or sheep or pig or duck or goose or something else, but not oil. The only oil for eating that was around was olive oil, and that was all of dubious quality and freshness and was sometimes used to dress salads or something. Thus, olive oil in the 19th century, when it shows up, is named as salad oil, which meant that almost every last drop of olive oil consumed in this period by people who considered themselves regular Americans was frankly rancid. The airtight multi-liter metal cans that are so ubiquitous today had not been invented yet. Some of it was showing up in America. Some was even produced in places that were soon to be the state of California. But most of what hit the general or rich American tables had been badly handled and tasted awful. And this bad experience with 19th century olive oil meant that Americans were suspicious of it until around 1990, when margarine suddenly became suspect. But that's another story. In the 19th century, there was no oil for browning vegetables, and nobody was going to do it anyway, even if there had been some butter about. What is this nonsense with pre-cooking vegetables before you're just going to cook them? But this jazzed up 19th century boiled beef recipe, you can probably sort of even construct the taste in your imagination. A bit watery, rather beefy, with a little thickness from the broth due to the gelatin extracted from all those bones. There'd be a bit of sweetness from the vegetables, maybe a hint of mysterious heat, maybe from the pepper, and something else indefinable from the bay and the allspice. But however you cut it, this meat and broth would be decidedly plain. The flavor, especially to our ketchup and mustard and salsa and mayonnaise and fish sauce and seasoned salt and syrup and soy sauce adjusted palates, might even call it disappointing. Much like their 19th century counterparts, the modern American palate would reach for the horseradish and brown bread and pickled cabbage to liven things up. And yet, this, for its day, was a pretty thoughtfully and carefully prepared stew. It had salt, it had spices, and the vegetables, plundered for all of their flavor, along with other inedible bits, were strained out before serving. This took time, skill, and having a certain amount of kitchen equipment. Say a second large pot and a strainer and such. But there were many people out there in the 19th century as they arrived from over the sea or expanded out to hand-built shelters, railroad camps, sod houses, and other single-room dwellings. They only had the one pot. Everything was cooked in it, and all, more or less, at the same time. And most of the people that were expanding out as America grew were coming from urban settings, or they were orphans, or they were coming from places where food was scant, so they had left. And many were men who had never cooked, ever, at all. The result? All the steps that are invisible to an eater: trimming the meat, scooping off the scum, choosing the right amount of water, adding any herbs or spices, straining the broth, and so on. For most of these people, such things were never taught. The home they left might not have ever had access to large pieces of meat, or a strainer, or even a dedicated kitchen. Or where they toiled, they never went into a kitchen to cook. In our freewheeling America, where you can be anything you want, more or less, it can be hard to imagine a life where your role was so circumscribed you weren't allowed access to food preparation at all. It was either given to you or there was no food. But regardless of the origin of all of these folks, many of the finer skills of stew preparation were not being taught to these people busting the seams of 18th century America and running out to the new edges of 19th century America. As kitchenless, teacherless, wandering, hungry people, proud traditions of how to stew things, or how to fricassee, or how to haricot, how to braise, how to ragout, it all fell out of the repertoire of the average pioneering American. Stew soon became a place where everything not used for something else went. And so without experience, many people didn't know that a potato, a carrot, a hunk of gristly beef, and a pigeon all take vastly different times to cook well. That, and not being able to tend fires because there were a million other things to do, the hearths were poorly built, and often no, or at least not enough salt was on hand, and no one had pepper. Oh yeah, and foraging for herbs was right out. Either because foraging was something only poor folks did, the cook had never been taught, or everything was just so different from what they knew. The result was stews ended up becoming unseasoned as well. And so, on the edges of the new country, two types of American classics arose. Not good, just classic. There's the watery hunks of meat stew and the pot of beans with salt pork stew. As you might imagine, the watery hunks of meat, often beef, but really any of many beasts would work. This stew is a poor cousin to the thoughtfully assembled, if slightly plain one at the opening of the show. The problem? Often all the water to go into the stew was added at the start. Enough was added to fill the pot instead of just enough to cover the meat. As a result, the whole thing started out watery and tended to stay that way. It took a long time to get all of that water heated up, and the meat was often strangely cooked. Oh yeah, and all those things we use to enrich a broth, give it some flavor, they were nowhere. There's no bouillon cubes, no fish sauce, no better than bouillon, no chicken bouillon powder to give this liquid any sort of flavor or body. And so when you don't know what to do, and you have one pot and a piece of beast, well, many a meat stew became more or less just beef, or something like it, boiled in water. And then it gets worse. Now, you'd think we'd been taught to think that if you cook any meat long enough, it would fall to bits. Well, no. And this was especially so for the extremely lean meats of all the animals that used to find their own food for a living. Before feedlots or even farms where animals were fed, all of our food animals, four-legged and fowl, had to work for their food. They had to walk for it, dig it up, and reach for it. And as any Carolina farm family raising forest cows would tell you, some of what they ate could give their meat some interesting flavors. Piney-like, or bitter from eating too many of the wrong acorns. Or they might just be stringy from having to walk around all day just to eat, along with not getting all the water they wanted. The switch to feedlots was not just about making things easier for the railroads and the meat processors. There were some real benefits to the diner as well. But more on that later when I get to refrigerated train cars and restaurants and steakhouses. Anyway, the muscle fibers of meat contains water and has parts that are soluble in water at higher heats. Cooked too long in too much liquid, the soluble stuff can rinse away, leaving just a rubbery mass. So meat, even in liquids, can be cooked past tender, where the structure collapses and what little fat that was present has all floated away. And the result? Somehow it tastes dry. So tough, unfatty beef cooked for too long in too much water to a tasteless, sad stew. That's one American frontier classic. The second, that pot of beans with some salt pork. Now, this is not baked beans, as I've pointed out. Baked beans, as they were originally devised, were quickly boiled beans that were baked low and slow to gain flavor. So, guess I just exploded my own no twice cooking vegetable matter categorization. Okay, stand by it. These are beans. That's different. But yes, stewed beans of past and legend. They fell into the family of stew where the frontier cooks tended to put in everybody at once. The advantage was that the salt, pork, and beans pairing worked flavor-wise because beans love plenty of salt. It is so hard to oversalt beans. You can do it, but it takes dedication. And when dried beans cook a good long time, they will release starch and create this nice brothy liquid. Unless, well, it turns out cooking dried beans is both easy and hard. If you're working with beans that aren't too old and dried out and you have plenty of fuel and you have enough time, you can produce a nice soupy pot of beans cooked to just done. And then when it's simmered with some bacon, smoked or salt pork that has been rinsed and stewed and cooked to soften it, maybe with a few vegetables for sweetness and herbs, the resulting pork and beans can be quite fine. But if you're working with dried beans from 3 or 4 years or who knows how long ago that are completely desiccated and the cook didn't know to soak them overnight or didn't have the ability to do so, and most of the time the kettle of water never really got up to a boil because either the fuel was stingy or the weather was just so cold or for whatever reason. And then the salt pork was thrown in at the start. Well, it's easy to end up with stringy, unrinsed, deadly salty, not quite cooked through pork and beans that are still crunchy, which of course means that then the water they were cooked in has not turned into a thickened broth. Instead, it's a sloppy, sad, salty bath. And then alternately, not enough water is added, the beans dry out and become a charred, undercooked mess. This was also an option. And thus, what would seem like the simplest of dishes could come out quite a calamity, which was the experience of many a traveler to many places who recorded unpleasant journeys and disastrous stays. As with the stewed meats, there was work and technique invisible to the uninitiated that separated a fine dish of pork and beans from the unpleasantly crunchy, watery, or charred mess that caused more than one diner to give up and go to bed hungry. Without guidance, without a proper hearth, without adequate pots and tools, without experience, this was the fate of many a pot of stew. The disasters visited upon soldiers as they waited in their fort or set up camp on their marches. Too many suffered through many a meal like this. For the messes, the groups that camped and ate together generally rotated their cooks, regardless of skill or interest in the duties of cooking. And the army manuals they used as instructions contained little or no direction on how to turn ingredients into food. They would provide the amounts to be used and sometimes which pot to cook it in, but beyond that, well, not a thing. As the 19th century progressed and America moved westward from its beginnings, it also left behind the secrets of how to make a good stew. But like I said last week, all was not lost. The people who were working in larger kitchens with plenty of tools and books and other cooks to learn from did retain the skills. And as iron stoves began to spread out with the growing railroads and more people had access to more pots and pans and a few strainers, colanders have been with us since fancy Dutch homes had them in the 17th century, good stew, was able to spread. And this was further helped along by the fact that stew works as one of the best canned foods. It's part of why canned baked beans have endured. It's why a can of pork and beans has been a staple of military rations and Americans on world travels. It's why Dinty Moore hangs on and Campbell's Chunky Soup continues to grow and evolve and has run ads during NFL games kind of money. Stew can be very good, and in fact, when you can preserve it by canning or freezing, it can be one of the best things to invest your time in. If anything, the best stews are even better the next day. So, if you're going to put in the time to make stew, let's put away all the don'ts and really focus on what are the do's you should do. What can the good stew makers that wrote things down in the 19th century tell us so we get it right today? If we start out south in the lands the Spanish still held in places like Florida, the olla podrida and the alcaparado have common roots. Both use plenty of kinds of meats. Meat could be stewed at a simmer, not too much water, and skimmed frequently. And in the Spanish recipes, a mixture of bay leaves, spices, and possibly garlic cloves and salty olives were added in. Once the meat was cooked through, then vegetables were added. onion always, and then whatever root vegetables were at hand. These would be cooked until just about done, and then any tender greens, fresh beans, or any other items that were sweet and in season would go in. And if you were that far south, tomatoes would have been available in season and appreciated, as would some chili peppers. Like the beef up top, it was typical to slice the meats, cooked at the beginning and stewed throughout. The cooked root vegetables would be served as an accompaniment, and the soup with the tender vegetables would accompany all. This style of one-pot meal, divided out into 3 parts, assumed that there were serving dishes and a table to fill up. But even at an inn or tavern of the nicer sort, vegetables and a soup, along with slices off the stewed meat, would be offered to travelers. In the least expansive of circumstances, where a bowl and a spoon were the only dishes at hand, meat and vegetables would be bashed or cut up into literally spoon meat, bite-sized pieces that could be picked up and eaten off a spoon, just like on the front of the Dinty-Moore stew cans. Moving up north into the decidedly English but French-influenced areas of the Delta states of Mississippi and Louisiana and the Tidewater areas of South Carolina, more herbs were used. Thyme and bay have appeared from the start, and the French love of butter was always present in cookbooks, but seasonal realities often meant that lard would stand in. But we are in the age when wheat flour and fine breadcrumbs are both fairly common, so the practice of sprinkling cleaned birds, chickens or ducks or turkeys or geese or small birds or rabbits, along with all manner of cuts of various farm animals, all of these items would be dredged in flour. And yes, the word dredging as a coating of flour shows up in early 19th century cookbooks, and then they were fried to brown that flour. That was the proper way to start off meat roasted in gravy or a fricassee, what we would recognize as a braise today. The cooked meat could either be stewed with vegetables to create a flavorful gravy or simmered in one made up from strong broth prepared earlier, sort of what we'd recognize now as a simmer sauce. The key to happiness and success was first frying the meat, and so adding flavor through browning before moist cooking the meat. For fun, I've pinned a photo of properly browned meat by a great recipe developer from the Catskills to my Threads post for the moment, in case you're wondering just how brown is. While the French on the Gulf Coast were developing their skills in a whirl of Spanish, African, Asian, and native cooking traditions, further up the Atlantic coast, the English adoration of the plain led the way. The preferences for sauces to be butter and something, with maybe a dash of mushroom or anchovy ketchup, reigned. But regardless, there was recognition that the stew, once the meat had been removed, but before it was served on table, absolutely needed a little extra attention to finish it off. Cooking for that long blends and flattens the flavors a bit, and they just need to be brightened up at the end. Even though the mid-Atlantic states were somewhat flyover states of their age when it came to food, the fish stews they came up with are still worth a look. Whether chowders or otherwise, it was recognized in the day that when it came to seafood, the stew base was cooked and flavored with some seasoning. It might be thickened with flour and dairy, making it a New England-style chowder, or it might be made red with chili and tomatoes, making it a summer-style fish stew that became known under the derogatory name of Manhattan style. So regardless of whether it was for dairy season or sweetened with summer produce, the base was made, and the fish, whether it was finfish or shellfish, that always went in only at the end. And the stews of even further north, made by and for people with fewer options in vegetables and a shorter growing season, well, these tended to depend more on root vegetables, the additions of vinegars, wine or beer, ketchups, and other bottled and preserved flavorings. Dried fruits also made appearances in stewed dishes, either in them or on the side. After all, that apples and pork combination, that's also been with us since just about the beginning. Fresh scraped horseradish also held a place at the table, since it was happy to grow in the cooler ground and wait patiently in root cellars until it was needed. And the tradition of wholemeal, rye-containing, and molasses-sweetened breads, whole hominy, and parched corn mushes were also an important part of the northern stew traditions, especially those that could cook alongside the simmering stews. Weekly bread baking in wood-fire ovens continued, but breads and other starches that could happen without an oven were incredibly welcome. The tradition of vegetable stews, not including stewed beans, were around in America at this stage, but only in fits and starts and usually in isolated cultural enclaves. African cooks using ground bene or sesame, filet or sassafras leaves, and okra knew how to thicken vegetable stews using vegetables. But the average American's enjoyment of comforting vegetable brews was clobbered in its infancy by the rise of the Grahamites and other vegetable and vegetarian enthusiasts. These no-spice crusaders, advocating water-cooked plain vegetables, did a disservice to vegetable and vegetarian cooking in general, and vegetable stews specifically. Their unfounded fears of seasoning and the enjoyment of food generally put mainstream Americans off of the prospect of meatless dishes for a very long time. So when it comes to advice for good vegetable potions, the published cookbooks with their vegetable messes of this era really have nothing to offer for the modern cook in search of stew advice. But the styles of meat stew of different regions definitely have pointers for us looking for good stew in the modern age, however we plan to make it. And the first piece of advice, there is no way to hurry a good stew. The best stuff just takes time. So if you're going to make stew, set aside the time, make too much, because it's often best when reheated anyway. Have a plan to cool and freeze it. You can also can it, but you'll need a pressure canner and actual instruction I can't give you. Second, brown your meat. Dredging it or not in flour is absolutely up to you, and both are a good idea depending on what you want. But do this extra step. Even if you are planning on just dropping stuff in the crock pot and walking away, do the browning step the day before, 2 days before. All that good flavor won't go away in the fridge. You'll wake it back up with heat. And if you're really in a pinch, at least fry up a couple of slices of bacon or turkey pastrami or a chicken thigh or even just a couple of mushrooms as you throw the rest of the things in. Just that little bit of high temperature browned protein will add so much flavor to the finished broth. Third, add dry spices and hearty herbs into the liquid you'll be stewing with. It can be and maybe should be water, but you can have some wine or beer or cider in there too. But make sure it's not too much liquid, just enough to cover the meat. Also, stewing needs to happen under a cover so you don't dry out. The fourth thing, consider skimming. If you're working with whole birds or large chunks of raw meat, if you can, skim off the crud that accumulates early on. If you're going crock pot or pressure cooker, with the crock pot, go high and skim stuff off after an hour or so. With the pressure cooker, if you have time, bring the whole thing to a boil, opened up for a few minutes, and skim the crud before you go under pressure. These are not essential, but if you're going to do a big cooking day, try to put this step in. Fifth thing, add the hearty vegetables, onions, carrots, root vegetables in about the middle, not at the beginning unless you plan to take them out. If you have to go with an all-day stew in the crock pot and can't do this, it's not the end of the world. But if you're going to be making a stew when you are around, this one is worth the trouble. Oh, and if you browned your meat, you can add raw onions. They add some fun flavors if added without being partially cooked first. Browning onions before they go into a stew was in some cases trying to make up for not browning the meat. Guess what? It does not. Incidentally, if you are planning to go past brown onions, which actually are more like a beige onion, and take it all the way to that deep, rich mahogany, well, do that. This is a worthwhile, different flavor that does something else. But those raw onions added into the middle of stewing and not at the beginning, that's a trick we lost. Add in some tender vegetables right at the very end, something that doesn't need anything but the cooling off heat of the stew to be ready to eat. something like baby spinach or fresh beans or peas or sorrel or even chicories. Nothing too bitter, or even celery tops. This step of adding something fresh at the very end got super dumbed down in the American culinary tradition to the point where modern stews just get a sprig of parsley before serving. And the final and seventh piece of advice gleaned from the piles of recipes I've been through. Doctor up your stew at the end. Well, most of the steps can be optional. This one and browning the meat or something before you get going will do the most and should not be neglected. Every single written recipe. Again, the 19th century recipes were typically short and slightly shorter. They all had a little phrase or tag or piece of advice at the end of how to just finish off the different stews before they headed out to the table. You taste for salt, you taste for pepper, you throw in a splash of pickled lemon or some mushroom ketchup or a chopped anchovy mixed with an egg yolk, or maybe finish with one last addition of butter, cream, or brandy. Because come on, nobody has ever been expected to get the seasoning of a stew just right after hours of cooking and stirring. And even if they did, it would still likely need just a bit of freshening up at the end. So on to the table. Serve your stew with something. Bread, even toasted stale loaf ends, crackers. Or noodles or rice or that sadly neglected category of mashed potatoes. Savory or sweet can work. Stewed pumpkin, tortillas, corn chips, corn grits, polenta, nut thins, those rounds made of crisped up cheese. Heck, I even saw radishes with butter as an option to balance out a heavy multi-meat stew. But your stew will just have a bigger and better life if you can have something to go alongside it. So as far as the 19th century, the cuts of meat, the times, the equipment, well, these all have less to offer us modern cooks. Though I admit as a person with access to Seattle fish, a sweet summer vegetable broth as the base of a fish stew does have much to recommend. The real lesson to be learned, if you're pondering stew, find a recipe that looks tasty, but asks you to take a long time making it. And do that while also doing other things. Make too much and dole it out over many days. And in our modern times, all of that doesn't have to be in a row. And whatever you do, don't be tempted by the 5 ingredients or less recipes. You'll be sad. You've spent all this time and it'll just be disappointing. Because those recipes, they definitely harken back to those watery stews we've been trying to leave behind ever since we were trying to build our own hearths and cook everything with that one pot. Next episode, let's check in on the national booze scene. What is up with American beer? Is it better or worse, or has it just gotten lost? And now that America has started to kill off the European grape with those little vine lice, the phylloxera, what is going on with American wine? And how's that whiskey thing going? What about rum? There are a lot of questions to answer, and I will do my best. Thanks for listening. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. It's really nice to see the new reviews, as your thoughtful comments are so nice to read. After all, it's still just me back here. Let more people know you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least find it interesting. And as I'm in my 4th season and have gone to this every other week schedule, I will still be dropping some interesting stuff into my feed beyond just the crossover episodes. Things on alternate weeks might get slow in December and January, as I have been on the road a whole bunch and have admittedly gotten behind. But the main show will go on. Music for this podcast is Finger Olympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Blue Sky, and Instagram, and everywhere else as @THOA Food. And all of this information is available in the show description.